morning, Rising Hope family.
You all may be seated.
I've got the pleasure of reading from the book of John, verses 13, 1 through 17. Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him and during supper. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wash them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean, and you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your lamb and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you should also do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." This is the word for God, for us, the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Dale. It's a long passage. It's the passage that the Wednesday night Bible studied, and Carrie said that I could preach on anything or I could stick to the program of preaching what they study on Wednesday night here so that we can hear it again in maybe a different way. I'm so thankful to be here with all of you. I've joined you a couple of times on some different outings, and I already love this church. So I'm serving right now at Arlington United Methodist Church in Arlington Temple United Methodist Church in Roslyn. And I will finish that in August and then come your way. So, will you pray with me? Creator God, Sovereign, Savior, Lord Jesus Christ, open our hearts today. Help us to hear your word. Help it to penetrate our hearts. Help us to know you more. And help us to hear what you would have us do, how you would have us live. Empower us to do your will. In Jesus' name, amen. So today's Bible passage and message requires us to use a little bit of our imagination. And it also requires us to think very hard about our most precious relationships. Will you do that with me? Okay. So how many of you are parents? Okay. And how many of you have parents? Or had parents at one time? Okay. Covered everybody. How many of you have a very significant relationship or friendship that you care about?
Yep. Hello.
All right, we got you. So, what I would like you to do is, as I'm speaking today, I want you to think about those relationships and that special relationship the whole time. Can you do that for me? Okay. So while you're thinking about that, I want you to take a moment, and I'm going to count to 10 while you're thinking. And I want you to think about what you would say to your kids, or your parent, or your significant loved one, if you knew that you only had a few more days to live. So take a moment and think about what you would say to those most important to you before you die.
I would say to them,
Okay, have you got something in mind? Okay. Would you agree with me that those words and actions might just be the most important words and actions of your life? In 2015, I was told that I had a tumor on my heart and that it would kill me if I didn't have open heart surgery to remove it. When facing this surgery, I also had to face the fact that I might just die. The first thing that I did hearing that news was I reflected on what my life had been. And more importantly, I focused on my kids, my husband, and other family members and friends. My greatest concern was for my kids. I thought about what I needed to say to them before the surgery, just in case something went wrong and I didn't make it. I found myself wanting to tell my kids everything they would need to know to ensure that they were prepared to live life well in my absence, should I die. I found that the one thing that I wanted to impress upon them most was that God loved them, that Jesus died for them, and that living a life that focused on God and was devoted to God would be the best life that they could live. I also wanted them to know that life without God would only bring trouble. I spoke from my own experience. I wanted to tell them that a life with God was also a life of mutuality in relationship with others. Mutuality in love, mutuality in service, in community with other people. And that living that kind of life, the kind of life in mutuality, was the best kind of life they could live. When I read this passage in John for this sermon, I found myself both relating to and imagining what Jesus must have gone through when he faced the reality of his imminent death. Will you imagine with me for a moment? Okay. So it was before Passover, and Jesus knew that the time had come for him to die. Jesus knew that he would soon be with the Father in heaven, and Jesus knew that he could trust God with all that was about to happen to him, even the process of dying. While with his disciples in that upper room before they started eating their Passover meal, I can imagine that Jesus let his mind wander for a moment. Like most people confronted with their imminent death, Jesus probably reflected on his life. He was probably drawn to the highlights of the past few years. I can imagine Jesus remembering the time with the centurion from Capernaum who implored him to heal his paralyzed servant. That centurion had such great faith that when Jesus said he would go to the centurion's home to heal the servant, the centurion said, "No, just speak the word of healing and my servant will be healed." I can imagine Jesus marveling at the centurion's great faith, as if it just happened yesterday. And then Jesus might have thought about Zacchaeus, that rich tax collector in Jericho, who climbed the tree to get a glimpse of Jesus while Jesus was passing by. I can imagine Jesus laughing to himself when he thought about how Zacchaeus had climbed that tree, and his face when Jesus said, "Zacchaeus, come down from there, because I want to stay with you today." And I can remember that I can imagine that Jesus thought and marveled at Zacchaeus' conversion. He appreciated that visit so much that he said, "I will give half of what I own to the poor, and I will make fourfold restoration to everyone that I've cheated." I can imagine Jesus thanking God for giving him the privilege of participating in Zacchaeus' conversion, as well as being thankful for Zacchaeus' newfound generosity. A few moments later, Jesus might have thought about Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, and how just a few days ago she poured an alabaster jar of very costly perfume on his feet and washed his feet with her hair as a service to him, preparing him for his burial. Jesus must have felt humbled while Mary washed his feet with her hair. And he must have also felt grateful for her extravagant love. After this brief but luxurious moment of reflection on his life, I can imagine Jesus being thankful for all of these people and so many more who shared their lives with him, who taught him so much about faith and life and how God was moving in their lives. But then Jesus began to focus on the people close to him who were with him at that very moment, who were waiting to be fed. John tells us that Jesus loved them until the very end. Jesus must have made a conscious decision to love them no matter what happened to him until the very end. And we know that he was successful in this commitment because John told us he loved them unto the very end. Maybe Jesus thought that by focusing on loving those closest to him, he could better face his death. In reading our text, it seems like Jesus' primary concern was to ensure that his disciples would be prepared to live well and to carry on in his absence. I can imagine that Jesus was concerned that the disciples might just forget everything that he tried to teach them. I can imagine that Jesus wanted to ensure that his disciples would never again argue about who would be greatest. After all, a concern about being great in this world is totally out of sync with what Jesus stood for. I can imagine Jesus at that moment silently praying and asking his Father to show him how to imprint on the disciples' hearts and in their minds how they should live. And and live it well after he was gone. At that moment, Jesus knew what he needed to do. So he stood up and he took off his robe and he found a towel and he wrapped it around his waist. And then he found a pitcher of water and a basin and a towel. And he began to wash his disciples' feet. As you may know, back then, in the first century, washing feet was a regular custom before eating. Back then, everyone living in Israel and Palestine wore sandals. And because the dirt roads and walkways, the people's feet were extremely dirty and filthy. Back then, people also reclined or laid on their sides when they ate. So they had to pull their feet up onto the host cushion, right? So it only makes sense that before they would eat, they would wash their feet because they wouldn't want to get the cushions dirty. So back then, if you were in someone's house, they would provide a pitcher of water and a basin and a towel for you to wash your feet before you ate so that you wouldn't get the cushions dirty. Just like we wash our hands today before our meals, they wash their feet. Now, what would you say to me if I said I'd like to wash your hands and your feet before you eat lunch today after the service? We actually talked about doing manicures, but it's not going to happen today. But Peter, he did not like that idea. He says, Jesus, I will never let you wash my feet. And Jesus responded just as fervently, if you don't let me wash your feet, you will have no share with me. What do you think Jesus meant by saying, you will have no share with me if you don't let me wash your feet? One scholar explains that to have a share with Jesus is to have fellowship with him and to participate fully in his life. Another scholar explains that foot washing is a symbolic act of heavenly end times hospitality, through which Jesus shares his home, that is, his Father's home, with his disciples. In other words, when Jesus washes the feet of his disciples, he is acting as a host in his and his Father's heavenly home. Jesus is communicating to the disciples that the end times have come. And from that moment on, the disciples are to relate to Jesus and his Father in the same intimate fashion that Jesus related to his Father on earth. In other words, Jesus was communicating that Jesus would be accessible to the disciples just like his Father was accessible to him while he was living on the earth. This meant that the disciples could call on Jesus at any time, and the disciples would be welcome to Jesus' home, and Jesus would be their host. It's really important for us to understand this. So I want to say it again. Through foot washing, Jesus is welcoming his disciples into his heavenly home to enjoy the same intimate relationship with his Father and him as he himself enjoyed with his Father. That's pretty amazing. Jesus was telling his disciples that they would, from that time forward, be welcomed in his Father's household both while they were on earth as well as for all eternity. In other words, Jesus was showing his disciples that even when he was physically absent from them, the disciples would still have access to him in his heavenly home, at his heavenly table. And Jesus and his disciples in the first, and just as his disciples in the first century would have access to Jesus, so do we in this 21st century. Understanding this can change our lives. Understanding this can help us to live well on this earth. Understanding this can help us live abundantly no matter the problems we encounter on this earth. No matter what our status is, no matter whether we are rich or poor, healthy or ill, imprisoned or free, young or old. Understanding this can help us to develop our relationships with God, with Jesus, and with one another, and have the same quality of relationship as the disciples had with Jesus. Understanding this helps us to know and experience that we are never alone, no matter what our earthly circumstance. So getting back to Peter, we now understand that if Peter would have persisted in refusing to let Jesus wash his feet, Peter would have been refusing to receive Jesus and his Father's heavenly hospitality. And Peter would have also been refusing to follow Jesus' practice of mutual love and service. Practicing mutual love and service was central to Jesus' life. Think about it. Practicing mutual love and service is what Jesus tells the disciples in that moment will be the key to their living life well and living life abundantly, no matter what circumstance is on earth. This is what Peter needed to learn that night. This is what the disciples needed to learn. And this is what we need to learn even in this 21st century. Jesus wanted to imprint on the hearts and the minds of the disciples that they must act intentionally in their relationship to ensure that they reflect the mutuality of both love and service. Because doing so would help them to live well and experience an abundant life. Now, what does mutuality of love and service look like today? Sometimes it looks like serving others, and other times like being served. Sometimes it looks like leading, and other times it looks like following. Sometimes it looks like delivering God's message, and other times like receiving God's message. Sometimes it looks like speaking, and other times it looks like listening. Sometimes it looks like giving care, and other times it looks like being cared for. This is the way Jesus had lived and with his disciples. This is the way Jesus experienced life on earth. This is the way that Jesus wanted his disciples to live, and this is the way that Jesus wants us to live in this 21st century. Jesus has modeled through foot washing that we are to be ever loving servant leaders. Jesus has modeled that we should lead by example, that we, just as he led. Jesus has modeled that we should work to develop mutuality in our relationships rather than the one-sided, self-centered, me-first relationships personally in our lives, or the hierarchical, top-down corporate relationships characteristically forged in this world, where the master or the boss gives the orders and the servant or the worker obeys. Jesus has modeled our relationships should not emphasize superiority or inferiority. Rather, they should emphasize equal value and worth of each person, no matter what the status of their job, no matter what their color or their gender or their ethnic origin. In fact, John tells us that Jesus said servants are not greater than their masters, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. Both are called to wash one another's feet. Do you remember the centurion at the beginning of our talk? That centurion was a man of authority, just like Jesus, a master and a Lord. He showed mutuality in relationship with his servant. Out of love of his paralyzed servant, that centurion searched for Jesus, asked Jesus to heal the servant, and believed that Jesus would help. And Jesus did. Jesus was blessed by the centurion's faith, and the centurion was blessed by Jesus' willingness to serve. The relationship was mutual. Do you remember Zacchaeus, the rich but unpopular tax collector? Zacchaeus was so thankful for Jesus' love and visit to his home that he in turn promised to be generous to the poor and make amends to those he had cheated. The relationship was mutual. Do you remember Mary, the woman who washed and anointed Jesus' feet with the costly perfume? Mary sought to bless Jesus by preparing him for his burial and demonstrated her love by using her resources to perform a service for Jesus. And Mary received much wisdom and counsel for Jesus as she often sat at his feet listening to him talk to Lazarus when he visited their home in Bethany. The relationship was mutual. In all of these relationships, we can see mutual give and take that Jesus enjoyed with each person. It is the same mutual give and take that Jesus desires for his disciples to walk in, live by, and extend to one another, as well as everyone they would meet in the future, while they remained on earth. Jesus knew that by continued mutuality in relationship with himself, with God, and one another, that the disciples would be empowered to live well, to be effective messengers for God's love after he died. John 13:17 of today's text says, if you understand these things, you will be blessed if you do them. So I conclude, I must ask, will you accept Jesus' invitation to enter into his Father's house and allow Jesus to wash your feet? Will you share or participate in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection? Will you intentionally form relationships of mutual love and service? I pray that if you are not already doing this, that you will begin from this moment forward. After all, foot washing is the only way to live life well and abundantly in God's house. Amen.